Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about painting large armor panels with no airbrush. If the video is helpful, please like and subscribe, it makes a huge difference. If you're interested in getting a commission or tuition at all, just get in touch through my Instagram and Facebook in the description below, or you can also get that stuff through Patreon as well. Thanks very much, I hope you like the video. So this is the Brass Scorpion blue tack together. I've primed it with Halford's grey primer. It's a car primer that's really hard wearing. I find it really good for Forge World. And then what I've done is I've just sprayed the armor panels black. And the reason for that is because I want a nice dark start. Now the big thing that we're looking at here is we're looking how the light is moving on those armor panels. So you've got lots of different shapes that you can work with, but I quite like the line that works all the way up, and that's how I'm going to highlight them. So my brightest point is going to be along that line, or a line like that, as we paint the model, and I'll show you as we go how that works. But it's always good to map out how you want to highlight something, especially on a larger model. It's always good as well just to have it as a reference to come back to, because it's quite easy, especially on more complicated models, to forget where your highlights are or where they should be. So just having something to refer back to is really good. Now these are the brushes that I'm using. These are makeup brushes with really soft bristles from Poundland. So for anyone who doesn't know what Poundland is, it's an incredibly cheap shop. These brushes are absolutely rubbish, and I'm sure they're pretty rubbish for makeup as well, but they've got really soft bristles, as you can see from me playing with the ends of them. They're surprisingly durable actually, but you'll be lucky to get that. But my point is, I'm using really rubbish cheap brushes here. Now Artist Opus do some nice dry brushes. I haven't tried them, but they would do the same job. But you can see these are the brushes that I'm going to use, and I'm going to do like a stippling motion at first, which I just demonstrated on screen. So I'm using a well palette for this, and the reason I'm using a well palette and not wet palette is a wet palette does actually make your paints wetter than they could be, and there's going to be points in this where I'm going to be working with paint that's not watered down at all. So as you can see here, I'm putting a small amount of water into this scale 75 deep red, but I want quite a strong mark. As you can see when I wiped it off on the tissue, I want a really strong mark. I don't want a lot of I don't want the paint to spread too much. The golden ratio you want here is you don't want this paint to clog up the details when you go near the trim, but you also want quite a strong mark because you want to leave that mottled pattern in the armor. We're going for a nice worn look. We're going to build up texture, and we're going to build up some interesting shapes in there. So as long as you're not losing detail, the paint is fine. So we really don't want a smooth armor panel. That's not what I'm going for. This is a Chaos Brass Scorpion, and even then, when you've got stuff like Imperial tanks, if you're going to add chipping and weathering and that sort of stuff, why would the paint be perfectly smooth? With an airbrush transition or a really smooth transition, you have such a perfect finish. It actually looks a bit odd when you add damage, because there's no surface damage or texture or really small marks in the actual paint in the armor itself, and this will solve that. So you can see what I'm doing on screen. I'm leaving a black line that's going to be underneath, that's going to be the bottom of the claw where it's in shadow, but at the same time, because for all intents and purposes the claw here is a cylinder, if we break it down into very simple shapes, you're painting a cylinder, and if you Google cylinders, you'll get loads of weird shapes, you'll get loads of really random reflections based on the type of surface it is, whether it's super shiny or super matte. But you will always have multiple shadow lines, and you will always have multiple highlight lines. So you can see the big red mark, the big red section is going to be the top, and that's going to be the main highlight, and that's going to be the brightest as well. The black is going to be the shadow line, and then the second red highlight on the left is probably not going to go any brighter than that, and it's just going to be like a secondary reflection. Now the next step is, if we go to the wet palette, you can see that I'm watering down some black paint. I'm exactly the same again. This is like a sketching stage. The paint's quite thick. All I'm trying to do is sketch out where I want my shadow and my highlight. And the problem right now is that black line that I have is all wavy, and I don't want that. I want it relatively straight and uniform, because the claw itself is a relatively simple sphere. There's no funny shapes to it other than the odd bend. So there you go. You can see clearly what I'm going for. Right, so next up on the main highlight section, the larger red, I haven't brought up on the wet palette this time because the paint consistency is exactly the same. So this is Vallejo Bloody Red. This is going to be my brightest red because I don't want anything too bright or saturated. So now I'm just going to build up that brightest point. Now you can see in the red at the moment there's some really strong black marks in the center there. The reason for that is I've worked with that paint when it's not dry properly. So what it's done is it's pulled the paint underneath off. Now with this type of painting, it's really easy to fix that because we can just go over it again. But it's something to really bear in mind when you're doing more detailed stuff. Make sure your paint is dry before you work with it. Otherwise that happens. And when you're trying to get, when you've got smaller space or more details or a smoother transition, it's much harder to fix. But in this case, nice and easy, hair dryer, make sure it's dry. Go back over it, get rid of it. So you can see again, I'm looking to create that line highlight. So this time I'm building up a line of blood red within the scale 75 deep red. And I'm not bothered about transitions at the moment. You can clearly see these different colors are just jumps from one to the other. This is a sketch stage. It's really important. There's no point spending loads of time painting and getting a really beautiful finish and then coming to the end and finding out that you've put a highlight in the wrong place or a shadow in the wrong place and it just looks weird, ruins all your work, and you've got to do it all over again. Trust me, I know from experience. So we're going to start softening these transitions now, or lack of transitions. So I'm getting my smaller makeup brush. The reason why I'm getting the smaller one is I want a bit more control. The bristles are a bit shorter as well, which makes them a little bit harder, which is what I want here. So going back to the scale 75 deep red, now you can clearly see this is almost like a dry brush. There's no water on that in that paint. It's straight from the pot effectively. I'm wiping off the majority of it because when I dab this time, I don't want a very big mark. Now, I'm not being careful. It's really important that you're not careful with this. You want to have some randomness because otherwise you're going to get patterns. Patterns are rubbish. The eyes automatically see patterns. Your brain automatically makes them. You want to avoid it at all costs. Twist your brush around, move it around so you get lots of different marks. Now, there's no easy answer to this, but what you're doing is you're going to influence that black until those hard marks disappear. So the easiest way to do that is to paint between the red and between the black. So you're simultaneously hitting both of those areas with the paintbrush. Having said that, as you go, you might find that you're still not getting the transition you want. And you're going to see me cover the black completely by the end of this as well, and that's because I'm having the same issue. But it doesn't matter because you can always go back and forth and make things darker and lighter. All right, so the only thing that I would say that I'm doing not well is move around what you're doing more. I get quite lazy because I've done this quite a lot. If you keep working the same part where you've put paint already, you're just going to pull the old paint off. So work around it more, better than what I'm doing, and be more random with it. So you can see that edge is softening now, but there's still a lot of work to do. So I'm going back to the black. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix something between the black and that deep red. Again, I'm not watering it down at all. These are straight from the pot. Because it's basically like a dry brush effect, but it's a combination of dry brushing and stippling. It's not original. People have been doing this for ages. I just think with the introduction and popularity of airbrushes, this sort of technique has really fallen by the wayside. It's not really done as much. So that mix between the black and the deep red, all I'm doing is now going back to that black line that I left. Because the thing is in my personal opinion, it's never a good idea to have black on a model until you really need it. Off black is always better, because as soon as you go to black, you can't go any darker. So I'm using this combination of the black and the deep red, and I'm just going back over the black line. I'm tinting that black line, and at the same time I'm pulling that transition together. It's also worth noting the way my brush is working is changing now as well. I'm stippling still, but at the same time I'm pulling my brush, because the stippling gives you a nice mottled mark and it gives you some texture, but the minute you pull your brush, that texture becomes far less, and what happens is it gives you a nice soft transition, almost like a blend. Just experiment with your brush marks. The more you stab and stipple and jab the paintbrush at it, the rougher and the more texture you're going to get into the mark that you put down, although it will still blend. The more you scrub that paintbrush or rub it along the surface, the softer a mark it's going to give, and actually it will give you a nice soft transition. So this is the point where you jump between the two, you have some fun with it and just experiment. You can't go wrong. It's so easy to fix anything. You just get some more paint and readjust it. Enjoy it. It really is a simple and quick technique once you know how. You can see here the results are starting to speak for themselves. That shadow side of it is a really smooth transition already, and you have some really interesting shapes and texture. So you can clearly see as I jump across to this blood red and start transitioning that, I'm no longer just using that stabbing motion. I'm rubbing my brush across as well, much like a dry brush. And for all intents and purposes, that's what you're doing. When you're doing this, you're just moving your brush in a more decisive way. You're making a conscious decision about how you move in your brush to get a different result. So the blend's looking good, the texture marks are looking good, but the blood red highlight at the top section is far too dark now, so I need to go and make that brighter. So we're going to go back to that Vallejo Bloody Red, and we're going to rebuild those highlights just over the top. So all I'm doing now is I'm bringing these transitions together. I'm softening the edges between the shades and the colours. I'm jumping between the Scale 75 Deep Red, the Vallejo Bloody Red, and the black paint. I think it might be Vallejo Model Colour Black. I'm not 100% sure, but black's black. All you want to do is use those dry brush style brush strokes where you're rubbing the brush across the model, and that will give you a soft mark. It will give you a nice soft transition. It will soften any really hard marks that you've made with the stippling effect. And just adjust it until you've got a result you like. I mean, I'm sure potentially you're not painting a Brass Scorpion, so your armor panels are going to be different. This is just a really good example of a miniature to use this technique on, but it works on any tanks. But yeah, so just soften it down. Experiment with how you move your brush. Sometimes a nice circular motion works really well if you've got small areas, as you can see on screen now, but I'll keep painting and hopefully you can see exactly what I mean and what the sort of things that I'm doing. So at this point you can see the armor panels looking really nice. Those transitions are fairly soft. We've got a really nice hard shadow with a really nice light red. My only problem here is, if I'm honest with you, towards the top of that armor claw, the panel for the claw, where I'm pointing on screen, good timing, I want that to be a little bit brighter because the light's going to hit that bit a little bit more. So I'm going to zoom in. You can see the texture that we have in the armor panel now. It's almost like a worn leather, but by the time you add scratches and weathering on top of that later on, it will look like there's tiny minuscule marks and imperfections in the armor, and that's far more interesting than anything else. That's far more interesting than just a really smooth airbrush transition. But yeah, so as you can see, I'm just going over and I'm just picking out and I'm softening the little bits. So I'm still making small adjustments before we go on to the final stage. So this is the big point, especially with larger models, or if you're painting in sub-assemblies, check the context of what you're painting to the model. Sometimes you need to take a step back. You need to either attach that piece to the model and just see how it's looking, or if it's sub-assemblies or you're painting even just a 28mm miniature, you need to set that model aside and look at it from far away. It's too easy to get caught up in looking at something up close. You lose the bigger picture, and that can be just as much of a problem. Right, so that top corner, I want to go a little bit brighter than the red. So what I'm going to do is I'm getting some of the Vallejo Bloody Red, and I'm using Vallejo Model Color Basic Skin Tone, and I'm just adding a little bit to the red. What this does is it keeps it in the red spectrum, so it goes to like a salmon color. So the reason why I prefer that to orange is I personally find that if I need to glaze over it to make it more red later on, which is what I'm going to do, it gives a much nicer color. So as you can see, salmon color, still quite thick paint, it's not very watery as you can see, and then I'm just going back and I'm dabbing towards the top, and I'm still following that line of red, because remember the shape, for all intents and purposes, you're painting a cylinder, and then what that's going to do is it's going to brighten up, it's going to make it a little bit pink. I didn't want that, so what we're going to do is we're going to add some color to it shortly, but for the time being, I'm just trying to get that nice soft transition again with the brighter color. So with the armor panel looking good as it is, I do want to bring it together a little bit, and I want to soften some of the harder marks that are still left over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some really thin Vallejo Bloody Red, and by thin I mean it's about 6 parts water to 1 part paint. So it's really thin, it's very fluid, and it's very translucent, and then I'm just going to go over the whole armor panel with it. Now, normally I wouldn't recommend going over a highlight, because it can make it quite muddy at times and you lose a lot of the brightness. But in this case, I want to change that salmon color to a red. So by going over it with this really thin paint consistency, it's going to tint it red. It will make the dark areas somewhat brighter, but they're hard to influence because they're so dark. And it will just pull these colors together and it will give you a nice finish. Now, if your paint is too thick, you're going to get a much harder mark and you're going to get a much nastier result. And you're also potentially going to lose that really nice transition that you've got. If your paint is too thin, all that's going to happen is you're going to need more coats. All right. So in this case, thinner paint is better if you're unsure, because if you go too thin, it's not a big problem. If you go too thick, you can ruin what you've already done. All right. So I've gone for about 6 parts paint, 1 part water. Basically, you want a really fluid paint, almost like it is you're moving around water. And you want it so it's incredibly translucent. So when you check it on the tissue, you should be able to see through that paint. So go over the model with it. You can use a hairdryer to dry it. I mean, you can, if you do it right, you might not even need a hairdryer because it'll be so thin that it dries straight away. I'm also using a massive brush, as you can see. The reason for this is every brush stroke you use leaves a mark. This is a big armor panel, so a big brush means it's only 1 brush stroke, only 1 mark. It's going to help with just that smooth finishing touch. So lastly, the thing to think about is, again, context. So you've painted this red armor panel or whatever color you've done it. It never looks right, or it never gives a fair reflection unless you paint around it. Now, in this case, there's a lot to be done. So I've just paint in the black trim and all the details around it in black, purely because it gives you some sense of what it's going to look like. Now in this case the trim is going to be brass, and we're going to do it in true metallic metals, and I'm going to show you how to blend from shadow to light on a true metal metallic in the next video. But black is enough. Black defines the shapes of what you've created, and it will show you a better result. And you're going to see by the end of this time lapse how much of a difference just painting some trim makes, or painting around a model. So if you ever paint and create something and you're unsure of the look of it, don't make a decision until you get to either the end of the model, or paint around it. Just paint black around that area. It doesn't matter whether it's a 28mm model or a massive tank or a flyer. Paint around it. It will give you a good example of how nice that actual finish is and whether it works or not. And you can clearly see with the black trim painted and just some black on the claws, you can really see what you've got and how nice a result it is. So here's a Scorpion all finished on screen. Everything is painted in black other than the red armor panels, and even then it's a really poor black. So I hope this video was really helpful. I hope it gives you some inspiration to try some new stuff. I know I've probably bagged on airbrushing a little bit in this episode. I love airbrushing. It's a great tool, but it's a tool. In my opinion, you can get far more interesting results with a paintbrush. This is one of them, and we've still got a long way to go on this Scorpion. I hope you like it. I hope it was helpful. If it was, like and subscribe, and do you know what? Share the video. It's a really big deal for me to keep going, and I want to make more. So thanks very much.